I would like to introduce our first speaker of the day, Asli Noor. Asli now is a postdoc research fellow at University of Oxford and specializes in computational demography. Her current research uses individual level modeling approaches to study gender, fertility, and family dynamics over the life course. And prior to joining Oxford, Asli worked on the development of FPSIM Ethiopia as a research scientist at IDM here. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of Washington, where she served as a graduate fellow with the Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology. And Asli also holds a MPH from Rollins School of Public Health at Emory and a BA from Washington University in St. Louis. And today she'll be discussing with us the utilization of FPSIM in modeling contraceptive method skill in Ethiopia. And I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for the introduction, Yini. And it's great to see you all. Good morning. It's closer. Closer to me. I'll just hold it. Good morning, and thank you for attending the session. As Yini mentioned, my name is Asli Abdi Noor, and I'm excited to be back in Seattle and to be back at the Foundation to share this work using FPSIM Ethiopia to study contraceptive method skew, which I conducted in collaboration with Michelle O'Brien and others at IDM. Let's see. Okay. Oh, that's bright. So recent feminist research has called for more person-centered or woman-centered approaches to the study of family planning behavior that accounts for women's changing needs and preferences, as well as constraints at the individual level. These alternative approaches center the experiences of individual women and elevate and evaluate the quality of care they receive by incorporating dimensions like patient-provider dynamics, quality of information received, and the availability of a wide range of methods and services. They also recognize that women's reproductive experiences are cumulative and dynamic, shaped by various factors throughout their life course that influence their choices and outcomes. Modeling of family planning has largely focused on population-level dynamics, which are designed to provide top-down, country-level estimates for policy and programming. But these models are often limited to standardized metrics and tend to have a hard time accounting for individual-level heterogeneity. They also often do not consider the changing nature of women's needs and preferences over time. So in summary, modeling at the macro level is not really designed to capture the complex and dynamic nature of individual women's reproductive health behavior, which limits our ability to effectively design and evaluate family planning programming and interventions. We'll just do that. Agent-based modeling presents an opportunity to model family planning behavior and biology at the individual level in an environment that is as realistic and contextualized as possible. So ABMs simulate the behavior of a population or a cohort of individual agents within an environment to observe emergent patterns and outcomes. In an ABM, each agent represents an autonomous entity capable of making decisions, including how they interact with their own life histories, with each other, and with their environment. Designing an ABM typically involves several stages, including the development of the model, calibration and validation, and running simulations to generate output. This data-driven modeling approach can be used to test hypotheses, predict behavior of complex systems under different conditions, and model the potential impacts of interventions and policies. The Family Planning Simulator, or FPSIM, developed here at IBM with many folks in the room involved, uses agent-based modeling to model individual-level heterogeneity as it relates to women's fecundability and contraceptive decision-making. So many of you have maybe seen this figure in a paper that was published on the model, but essentially it gives an example of a random FPSIM agent. And as you can see, as they age through the model, you can see changes in their fecundability in the blue line as it increased until the age of 25 and then began to decline gradually. You can see that this agent was sexually active on and off throughout their reproductive life course, having had several pregnancies carried to term, represented by the black vertical dash lines. And the red line, the red dash line being a stillbirth at the age of 30 and two green lines representing miscarriages. After the fourth child, she began using pills, and after the sixth child, she switched to an implant. So this model was, this is just an example of one agent within the model that can be constructed. The model was developed in Python and calibrated for Senegal, with additional calibrations developed for Kenya and Ethiopia. And once a model is calibrated to a specific context using multiple data sources, hypothetical scenarios, and investigations, a research questions related to contraceptive methods and family planning programming can be created. So for today's presentation, I will be focusing on the calibration of FBSIM to the Ethiopian context and its use to study contraceptive method skew. So to give some background, between 2000 and 2019, the contraceptive prevalence rate in Ethiopia increased nearly fivefold, from about 5.9% in 2000 to about 28.8% in 2019 among women aged 15 to 49. This dramatic increase in contraceptive coverage over 2 decades has been celebrated as a family planning success story, representing Ethiopian women's improved access to contraceptive methods. But a closer look at the distribution of total contraceptive method use, or total contraceptive use by method, also known as method mix, reveals that over 85% of women using contraception today currently rely on one of two methods, injectables or implants. The majority of these contracepting women are using injectable methods like Depo-Provera. The skewed distribution of contraceptive methods limits women's and couples' ability to exercise agency over their reproductive choices. In Ethiopia, the dramatic increase in contraceptive use and the dominance of a single method, injectables, also raises questions about method skew and women's contraceptive choice. So for this project, we essentially had two main questions. The first being to look at what the method mix is in Ethiopia and to what extent it's skewed. And then from there, to explore how changes. Is that me? Okay. Oh, it's good. Okay. How changes in individual level decisions about contraceptive use, for example, changes in uptake, switching, and discontinuation behaviors can impact method mix. Oh, that's not good. Did I do that? Okay, we're back. Okay. The field of global family planning does not endorse an ideal method mix. However, the predominance of one or two methods in a given setting calls into question the extent to which a skewed method market can meet the demands for family planning, which exist at the individual and couple level. Contraceptive method skew refers to the uneven distribution of contraceptive methods used in a given population. A high level tends to indicate that a significant majority of the individuals or couples rely on a limited range of methods, and this may be due to a wide variety of supply-side factors, including limited availability of other methods, insufficient information on the options available, or provider bias towards certain forms of contraception. So we quantify method skew based on work by Chaurasia in 2021, which classifies method skew as very low, low, average, high, or very high based on this scale. And we give some context on how we measure that or quantify that. So we begin by identifying the prevalence of a given method and the all methods prevalence, or CPR, and then take the proportionate share of a method based on the total contraceptive use as calculated in the first equation there, such that the sum should equal 1. And then from there, we use the proportionate share of a method as a weight, such that the larger proportionate share corresponds to a larger weight. And this allows us essentially to calculate the weighted use by method, which we then normalize with this index for the number of contraceptive methods available to ensure that we have a positive value. We take that positive square root, resulting in a final method skew index number. And that number is, again, what sort of corresponds to that scale. Previous research on method skew tends to classify it as occurring when one method represents 50% or more of total use. But this updated approach advances that work by moving beyond a binary measure of skewed or not skewed to explore the degree to which skewness in method mix exists in a given setting and how that might have changed over time. So here are some of our results just from that sort of first step of quantifying method skew. We find that in 5 out of the 11 regions, injectables, as I mentioned, account for over 50% of total use. Notably, in 2 regions, Gambella I don't even know if there's a pointer on this, but hopefully the text is large enough. In Gambella and in SNNPR, over 75% of contracepting women are using injectables. Across all regions, both implants and injectables combined for over 50% of total use. And I should mention that this SNNPR now has broken into smaller regions, but based on the available DHS data we have, we continue to use that classification. So in total, we're able to essentially present these results for 11 of the regions based on DHS and PMA data up to 2019. And we include the national figure as the overall in the bottom right. So next we turn to the development and implementation of FPSIM Ethiopia to explore the issue of method skew in more detail. So we initialized the model with a historic population pyramid to create a fictional cohort. And once introduced into the model, this small cohort of FPSIM agents experiences a wide range of life course events. As I demonstrated in a previous slide, an agent can experience fertility-related events, including sexual debut, starting a method of contraception. Regarding pregnancy outcomes, she might conceive, terminate a pregnancy, or face a miscarriage in the initial stages. And if the pregnancy progresses, she might encounter different birth outcomes, like a live birth, stillbirth, infant mortality, or her own mortality during childbirth. Following a live birth, the agent might engage in breastfeeding or postpartum abstinence. And these events and decisions are almost entirely probabilistic within the model, informed by factors such as the agent's age, previous experiences, and/or life stages. All of these events lead to a population of individuals with heterogeneous life course trajectories. Our process continues with the identification and curation of relevant demographic data for Ethiopia. So after reviewing comparison data for Senegal and Kenya calibrations, we compiled a set of fixed parameters from multiple sources of data, including the DHS, Ethiopian Statistical Service, PMA, the World Bank, and United Nations WPP estimates, as well as peer-reviewed journal articles. So this table here just sort of gives an overview of the multiple data sources used to parameterize the model. Next, we calibrate FPSIM to understand how the model performs based on existing demographic data. So in addition to the fixed parameters established in the previous stage, we also use free parameters to help further calibrate the model. These include estimates of the residual exposure to either pregnancy or live birth by age and parity, as well as postpartum birth spacing preferences. The figures here illustrate model performance based on the calibration at the national level. And as I mentioned, adjustments are made to the free parameters based on data-driven assumptions to refine the model output. So we include these estimates of sort of common fertility and family planning indicators just to show how we evaluate model performance. So the exciting part, we then test a series of hypothetical scenarios designed to improve our understanding of the relationship between contraceptive choice and method mix. As I mentioned, we calculate method skew, index values for different intervention scenarios. So the first simulates women's improved access to 2 tier 1 methods, contraceptive implants, and injectables. For all scenarios, we set the initial number of agents to 100,000. And so in the first set of scenarios, we see an increase in the initiation rate by increments of 1.5% starting in 2016. And the decision to use this rate was data-driven, informed by trends in previous contraceptive use observed between 2000 and 2019. In the second and final set of scenarios, we also include the combined initiation intervention, which is at the end there. And we also include 5-year interventions that gradually improve women's access to each method starting in 2016. The results of this intervention are projected out to 2030 and presented in the tables above. And you can see that we essentially take the combined initiation, we take the 7.5% initiation, given sort of the model performance previously, and we focus in specifically on IUDs in this case because we saw that to be the most effective in improving the method skew index value. So based on IUDs, we also explore scenarios related to discontinuation and initiation and the introduction of a new IUD. And the reason that this is important in this context is that there has been growing use in IUDs, but it still lagged quite a bit behind other methods. And so one question is if, for example, they're predominantly copper IUDs in Ethiopian context, maybe the introduction of a hormonal IUD, which is what we model here, might be an alternative that we could explore through an intervention scenario. And in fact, that is what we find, that the most impactful intervention introduces a new hormonal IUD to the method market. And I should say we do adjust for the number of methods. So it's not just that. Obviously, the introduction of a new method would lead to more method skew, but we use our calculation that I showed previously to make sure that we're taking into account based on the number of methods available in the market. And we still find that the introduction tends to be the introduction of a new method, I should say, was the most effective. And for those interested in using FPSIM, I also just offer an example to sort of plot that and show some of the examples of the intervention scenarios. As you can see, there is still some skew, but the values bring into the what's considered sort of the average range. And I think it's also worth noting that the scenario is not only the most effective in reducing method skew, but it also increases the overall number of users of family planning to 38.8 by 2030 based on this modeling. So these are also consistent with sort of the expectations that women's improved access to new methods would be most effective in reducing contraceptive method skew. I had 1 minute left, I think. So these are just sort of the conclusions here, giving you an overview of this project which used FPSIM, and so hopefully highlighting and drawing some interest from you all in the potential use of the model to explore issues like contraceptive method skew or other issues related to family planning. And some of the results essentially demonstrating the value of this individual level modeling approach and hopefully developing more effective women-centered programming and policy interventions. And before I conclude, I want to give a big thank you to, as I said, many folks that are in the room, Michelle, Emily, Cliff, Marita, Anu, Navide, Annie, and Elizabeth, who all helped and were wonderful collaborators in the development of FPSIM Ethiopia and incredibly formative to my experience working with IDM. So with that, I'll say thank you.
Thank you, Asli. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation and being our first speaker of the day. Yeah. Now I'll open the floor for 3 minutes Q&A session. Any hands up? I didn't see any questions in the Zoom, but yeah, this is go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you. Very interesting. Excuse me if you mentioned it, but I didn't capture. Did you use any real-world data to see how much the women are using actually in Ethiopia different anticonceptive methods, surveys or purchases?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So no, I wasn't.
No, because I understood perfect the model. It was very interesting, but.
Yeah, so let me make sure I take this with me. Yeah, so basically, I know I went through this slide very quickly, so I appreciate this question because we include, we sort of show the data source that we pull from, and that's the benefit of this kind of modeling is that you can draw in multiple data sources. And so, for example, we have contraceptive use, which we include for the subnational models with subnational data, but then at the national level as well. So I think you can see we, in the event of some of the subnational data, based on, I think, some data collection aspects for the national, we use PMA data, whereas for subnational data, we actually use the Ethiopian DHS. Yeah.
Yeah, great talk again about the data sets. To my knowledge, I think Ethiopia has quite a number of health and demographic surveillance sites that would actually inform the switches. Is this one of the data sets that you might include in the study, or do you think that these cross-sectional repeated surveys also provide good data for the model in context of the parameterization?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think we are always interested in including more longitudinal measures. And I think that's something as well with the launch of FPSIM 2.0 or FPSIM Plus, depending on your preference, I think, where I think in the Kenya calibration, they are using more longitudinal data sources and using, especially I think in particular, some of the work with the PMA survey. So I think for this, there are a lot of things that might change, which I'm actually quite excited about, just because, for example, there's the expectation that there will be a new Ethiopia DHS. I think PMA just released an updated cross-sectional data set. But to that point, I think that's sort of the strategic value. So while we use this in this case, I think the ability to update and revisit how we include some of that parameter data will probably be increasingly helpful in improving sort of the model performance, especially as we're sort of, for this, in some cases, right, the last Ethiopian DHS was 2016, and that's quite, out of date now. And so I think with the introduction of some of these other data sources you're talking about, I think to keep sort of refining the model, which will certainly need to happen, and especially with the subnational work, I think that's a direction that I would really like us to move in. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, I did. I'm curious whether if you see sort of like general dynamics patterns that keep occurring, such as like winner takes all or things like that. And I guess a follow-up question is more like the specific methods and characteristics that you find a method that would attribute to that kind of patterns.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think to your first question, and maybe this would be a helpful place. No, wrong direction. Maybe this would be a helpful place. I mean, it's sort of not surprising that some of the places that have a more evenly distributed method mix are urban areas. Like, so in particular, Addis Ababa, which is the capital city and also treated as an administrative zone or region, and Diradoa, you see that to some extent. So there's a story there, I think, just around sort of access, right, that I would love to sort of explore further. And then can you remind me your second question around? No, oh, okay. I guess I'll just say that I think there are certain aspects that we're hoping to explore a little bit more, which I will just tease, which is to say looking at provider dynamics as far as contraceptive counseling. So that's something that has been in development in the model, and I think particularly looking at that at the subnational level, because the decentralized nature of the sort of health system means that it's really important to be able to look a bit more granularly at this. And if I'm loosely remembering the second question, I think that might get to that as well, where I think these are some of the dynamics and the benefit of being able to develop new modules and new components to FBSIM to explore a lot of these different areas.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And we'll get back to more discussion after our presentations.
Okay, I had a question for the first speaker, which relates to one of the questions that was asked. I'm curious, how would your results look like? Because the question that talked about using repeated cross-sectional data versus using a longitudinal data, how do you envisage your results to change, or what new insight would be generated if, for example, your data was in the longitudinal format? And then to the second speaker, I think I enjoyed the methodology that you have used, but I was curious to what alternative approaches are available to generate the same kind of insights, and whether you have explored the different results that you would get if you had used maybe an alternative methodology, especially comparing that to what the agent-based modeling approach is. What is unique about yours, or what new insights would be generated from your approach as compared to the alternatives that probably are also available? Thanks.
Great questions. Yeah, go ahead, Ashley.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Thank you. I think in general, these are very data hungry models. So I think the more data you can have and the more granular data you can have, certainly the better. And as I sort of tried to show with some of the multiple data sources, you can see, for the DHS, you have essentially for Ethiopia, 2000, 2005, 2011, 2016, right? There was a mini DHS in 2019 with a much smaller sample size. And of course, as I mentioned, we're waiting for 2024. So I think the ability to have more consistent data sources and longitudinal data sources in general is just an asset to the model. And I think we've seen that in other calibrations and in the ability to develop new modules, for example, or to sort of expand your research questions just by having improved sort of data. So I think As much as you can sort of offer into these kinds of models, it tends to be very useful. I don't know if others have maybe thoughts on the development, more sort of involved in the full development of FPSIM broadly. But I think that's sort of the direction. And I would imagine that, for a lot of our research, if you can have that really rich longitudinal data collected more frequently, then it really helps to feel a lot more confident in your estimates. Do you have a follow-up or?
Would you recommend that, given that my data is limited in some way, that I can still make policies based on the results that you have generated? How trustworthy are these results?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So the question was if I'm a policymaker, sort of how confident am I in the results? Is that right? I think that I think that the benefit of this and the sort of strategic value of an agent-based model versus just saying we have this kind of regression analysis, right? And we're turning over these, that's not to diminish very clearly that at all, is that these are hyper contextualized models. And so in particular, I'm thinking about the focus on the subnational piece, right? Because I presented nationally largely in the interest of time, but also sort of just to give a general overview of the model for FPSIM Ethiopia. But the goal is that once you can get to the subnational level, and once you can really think about who your target audience is, who your stakeholders are, then the idea is that you are sort of turning over a model where you're saying, this is all of the data that we've pulled in, this is all of the available data that we have. And so based on the information present, then we're confident because we are using a range rather than just saying we take one survey that's cross-sectional. Maybe we have longitudinal data. We're including, for example, in this, data from the Ethiopian Statistical Service. And so I think, I feel that we, can be confident in the results that we produce from this, and that also there is stakeholder engagement to feel like it's also responsive to the specific things that folks are working on directly. So I think the goal is to get it as granular as possible so that it actually also matches sort of the demand for what this kind of model can do. But, as with all models, it is a model, right? But I think that's hopefully helps to answer your question about sort of how we allow it to be tailored to hopefully be answering very targeted specific questions that would be of interest with a high degree of confidence.
Thank you, Asli.